The day that changed my life started out as a normal day. It wasn't until I got home from work that I got the bad news. My wife, Karen, was waiting for me at the kitchen table. "Please sit down, Rich. We need to talk." I knew immediately that this was going to be bad. "I'm sorry, but I've already moved out of the house and filed for divorce." Karen spoke quickly and didn't look at me. Her words seemed rehearsed. She handed me a manila envelope across the table. "Where are the kids?" At this point, I was just in shock. "I moved the kids and they will be living with me. But don't worry, you'll have lots of dates. I met someone else. You know, things haven't been smooth between us for a long time. I'm sorry, but there's just no way to tell you that. How can things be good between us if you're seeing someone else?" At least she had the decency to look guilty and sad at this point. "I'm sorry about what happened, Rich. I really am. I wish things could have been different. I have to do what's best for the kids and for me." "What's that asshole's name?" I asked, my anger building. "I'm not going to tell you that. It's only going to cause trouble. So this guy makes me a cuckold, takes my wife and kids away from me, and you think you can avoid trouble? I get it. If you're going to talk like that, I'm leaving," she said, getting up and walking out the door. Her act was a shock, but not that unexpected. We hadn't had sex in months, and we hadn't gotten along as spouses in almost a year. I suspected something was wrong and had tried to talk to Karen many times. She always told me there was no problem, that it was my imagination. Yes, that's right. Karen was a beautiful woman. Tall, sultry, with a great body. She had great taste in clothes and knew how to wear them. I should have followed her more closely rather than working 6 days a week for a living. We played golf at the municipal course, but she preferred the country club when she went there with a friend as a guest. We argued constantly about joining the club. I wanted to wait a few years, but Karen wanted the good life now. I was willing to bet that her new man was already a member or would be soon. I considered having a private investigator watch her, but never did. Perhaps I should have, but what difference would it have made? Our marriage ended the first time she gave herself to another man. The next day, I called the attorney I use for my business, and he referred me to a divorce attorney. I was able to make an appointment for the next day. I told him that my biggest concern was my children. I wanted to know where they were and when I would be able to see them. We learned from my wife's attorney that she and the children were living in a house owned by one Gary Anders. He was about 10 years older than her and belonged to the country club. Old money. It seemed Karen had decided to trade me in for a husband with more money, a bigger house, and a country club membership. My lawyer sat me down at the table and gave me the bad news. Karen was a stay-at-home mom, and she would get the kids half the value of our house and probably half of my business. That night was the low point in my life. I was living alone in an empty house. My children lived in another man's house, and my wife slept in his bed. I had spent years working my ass off to support my family and provide them with a better life and future. Now I was cast aside. My family was gone. I reheated a frozen dinner but found that Karen had taken all the knives, forks, and spoons. Looking around, I found a plastic fork and sat down to eat. That plastic fork was the last straw. I immediately vowed to myself that I would not let this situation go unaddressed. Whatever I had to do, whatever the cost, or whoever I had to kill, it wasn't going to happen. I had been running my own equipment rental business since I got married 8 years ago. Things were going well, but I wasn't getting much money from the business except for a moderate paycheck and bonuses. All profits were reinvested back into the business. I was buying new equipment as fast as I could. I told Karen 100 times that, for a few years, we needed to save a little money for our personal lives. Every dollar invested in new equipment would come back tenfold in the form of rent for it. Karen preferred instant gratification, first-class flights and massages at the club. Karen was kind enough to allow me access to the kids. 7-year-old Cheryl and 5-year-old David were at my house every weekend, and I took them out to eat usually one night a week. It wasn't what I wanted, but my lawyer pointed out that it was better than most fathers. The lawyer gave me a bit of advice. Don't get mad. Get a house. Sort of a play on words from the divorce lawyer. He told me that she had a legal advantage and I had a moral advantage. If she played me, left me with the kids, and moved in with her lover, it would not meet with approval in our society. I had to use that to my advantage. If I had resorted to violence and vindictiveness, I would have lost my moral ground. He also pointed out that my wife should have felt guilty in this situation, and she was probably getting a hard time from friends, family, and our children. These were advantages to our side. I took his advice and tried to swallow my anger as best I could. It tasted pretty nasty, but one day soon, I would have my revenge on her and her lover. My lawyer had been right about the reaction of friends and neighbors. They were shocked. Karen's own family was dead set against her. Her parents called me to ask about reconciliation. I told them I had nothing to do with the breakup and that it was their daughter they needed to talk to. One evening, Karen came back to the house to talk to me. She was actually trying to convince me that our breakup was for the best, that we could talk things out, and everything would be okay. Karen, look around this house. It's an empty shell. I don't have a wife anymore. I don't have kids anymore. I don't have a life anymore. It's not a home anymore. It's just a house. Karen, you ruined it all to get rich quick with your new man. At this point, Karen cried, and I asked her to leave. The children were a source of information about what was happening in Karen's new and improved life. However, the best information I got was from friends. Typically, Karen would tell a friend, the friend would tell her husband, and the husband would tell me. They knew our breakup was a hot topic for months. I found out that Karen wasn't the only one who had gone on a cheating spree. Anders had had his eye on her for a long time and had eventually gained her favor. Karen's lawyer offered me a 60% division of our assets. My lawyer realized it was a gambit for a quick settlement. Karen didn't need my money, and Gary Anders already had more than they could spend. We decided to wait a bit and see if we could get more. I learned through the grapevine that Karen and Gary were planning a wedding in June. The country club was already booked. It was Gary's first wedding, so he was putting his best foot forward. He could afford it. Under normal circumstances, Karen had plenty of time to get a divorce and have the wedding in June, but my lawyer was sure he could drag things out until then by resorting to a few tricks. He asked me if I needed to travel to Europe on business in the near future. I replied that I needed to investigate a new line of generators being manufactured in Scotland. Karen's lawyer quickly figured out the time-stretching tactic and asked what it would take to get a quick divorce. I wanted to say she would walk away with nothing, but my lawyer said that wouldn't hold up in court. We'd better give her something, or we'll look like we're taking advantage. We offered her 50% of the value of our house when it's sold, or in 10 years, whichever came first. No money, no alimony, no child support, no part of the business. Not now, not ever. She agreed to the deal in a heartbeat. They must have already printed the wedding invitations. At my insistence, the contract clearly stated that this was a final deal, and I didn't want Karen coming back later for more money. I stopped buying large amounts of equipment immediately after Karen moved in with Gary. The few items I did purchase were on credit. I started saving cash as soon as I could. The divorce was finalized in February, just in time for the wedding. As soon as I was free, I started looking for a house. I soon found a house with 5 bedrooms, a pool, and an apartment for my father-in-law over the garage. The house had a large yard for the kids and woods surrounding it. I got a big bonus from the business and paid cash for the house. I rented out the old house so I wouldn't have to pay Karen her 50% interest until after 10 years. One Friday, I picked up the kids from school and took them to the new house. They loved it. I called Karen and told her the new address to pick up the kids on Sunday. When she arrived and saw the house, she was dumbfounded. "How can you afford a house like that, Rich? I always told you that business would pay off someday, Karen. Did you really think I was fooling you?" "I should have waited a little longer." "But Rich, the mortgage must be killer." "I paid cash for the house, Karen. You should have paid more attention to the business. The rental properties alone are valued at over $5 million. "Rich, I had no idea. Really, I had no idea." I could see the regret in her eyes. "I've told you often enough, Karen. It's a shame you didn't listen." I joined the country club and enjoyed watching Karen and Gary's reactions when I ran into them at the bar. Seeing them together was hard for me, but I knew it was even worse for them when I was around. Karen kept glancing at me. I think she was experiencing buyer's remorse, at least I hope she was. One of my oldest customers was L. He regularly rented out generators and temporary heating and air conditioning units. I also knew he was what people called a liaison. I had a very personal conversation with him about what I wanted to happen to Mr. Anders. I emphasized that I wanted it to look like an accident. He told me that the accident part would cost more. He could put me in touch with the right people or mediate for a fee, about a third of the total cost. I liked the idea of Al being my only contact and the only one who would know my identity. The extra money was worth it. Al contacted me about a week later and told me it would cost me 7 boxes of ZD, in other words, $75,000. I gave him the okay, reminding him that it had to happen before the wedding in June. As the weeks went by, I became increasingly anxious as the wedding date drew nearer. Then, less than a week before the wedding, Gary Anders was found dead in a cheap motel outside of town. Apparently, the night before his death, Anders had been partying at his bachelor party. There was a stripper and the usual drunken fun. Toward the end of the night, 2 sexy women showed up with Gary in tow. The partygoers mistook them for prostitutes hired to entertain the groom. They escorted him out of the party and took him to a motel, where he snorted coke, among other things. Then he snorted heroin. And that was the end of poor Mr. Anders. I remember when Uma Thurman accidentally snorted heroin in one of my favorite movies, Pulp Fiction. Heroin is a lot like cocaine, but snorting it is not a good idea. Too bad John Travolta wasn't there to save Gary. Do I regret his death? Hell no. He robbed me of my wife and kids. Had he been alive, I would have spent the next 20 years watching him act like the father of my children. I mentally pictured sitting in the back of the church at my little girl's wedding and watching him walk Cheryl down the aisle. That ain't going to happen now. That $75,000 was the best money I ever spent. From what I understand, they never found the prostitutes or figured out who hired them to entertain the groom. The good news was that they determined it wasn't foul play. A couple of days after the funeral, I visited Gary's grave and stuck a plastic fork in the ground. I was saving it. Karen was understandably disappointed by Gary's death. I know that's an understatement, but I just didn't care how upset she was that her dream life had turned into a nightmare. Welcome to the club. 3 months after the funeral, a lawyer showed up at Karen's house. He was very gracious, but the Anders family wanted to know when Karen and the children were going to move out. Karen wasn't in Gary's will, and she wasn't his wife. Plus, Karen had charged wedding expenses to credit cards in her name. Now she had no income and no sugar daddy. Karen ran to her attorney, who dragged me back to court again, demanding an emergency modification of the divorce decree. The judge was unimpressed with her lack of income and recommended that she get a job. He noted that Karen had been happy with the deal just a few months before. He also noted the wording, "Final deal," above Karen's signature. Gary Anders and his money were never part of that deal. Therefore, according to the court, his death changed nothing. During the trial, one of Karen's attorneys threw funny looks at me. I thought he was marveling that Gary Anders' death came at such a good time, after the divorce and before the wedding, the worst possible timing for Karen. Well, let her watch and wonder. My attorney indicated that since Karen and the children would soon be homeless, the children should come to live with me. Because of my ex-wife's financial situation and in accordance with the terms of the divorce, I would not be seeking child support. Much to Karen's disappointment, the judge agreed with my attorney. Outside the courtroom, we agreed that the children would be moved to my home the next day. Karen was in tears, but I was unaffected. I asked her to have lunch with me the next day to talk about the house sitter. Having Cheryl and David with me was great. My sister had moved in with them for a few days so they could get settled and rebuild their relationship a bit. At lunch, I dropped an ex-bombshell. "Karen, I'd like you to take the housekeeper/nanny job." "Are you serious?" She wasn't sure how to feel about the idea. "I'm very serious. There's a separate apartment in the house that you can use as your own. I'll pay you $400 a week plus room and board." But the best part is you'll be with the kids every day. That sounds too good to be true, Rich. There has to be a downside to this deal. Well, Kathy, there are a few special rules you will have to abide by. The first rule is that you can't date or get boyfriends while you live in this house. The second rule is that you will provide me with sex, wherever, whenever, and however I want it. Karen was stunned. You must be out of your mind. Do you really think I would agree to be your slave? Not a slave, Karen. You won't be flogged. And you don't need to call me master or anything like that. You won't be harmed. Well, there might be a few spanks, but nothing too painful. Karen sat silent for a few moments, then asked, And you won't have any girlfriends? I knew immediately that I had her in my sights. She was going to buy this deal. I wondered if the spanking requirement would be a plus or minus in her decision. I couldn't wait to find out. I'll have any girlfriends I want, but I won't bring them into the house or poke you in the nose. Are we going to do everything as a couple, Rich? Play golf, go to movies, parties, that sort of thing? We won't be married, Karen. Ever. Those days are gone. But if you treat me right, serve me with a smile, so to speak, then we'll be fine. Treat me right and with respect, and I'll do the same with you. You will still carry my last name. We will live in the same house and have children together. However, I will never again put my trust in you. We will never marry, and I will throw you out on the street with nothing if you ever cross me, disrespect me, or refuse me. 2 days later, Karen moved in. Her son-in-law's apartment. The kids were happy that we were all back together. I let Karen get settled the first night, but on the second night, I told her, Take a shower and come to my room tonight at 11 o'clock. Please wear something nice. She hesitated but eventually agreed. I came out of the bathroom and saw her removing her robe. She was wearing a sheer black nightgown. She walked over to me with a small smile, perhaps expecting affection. Life carried on smoothly for a while, but one day, she didn't come to my room in the morning as usual. I went down to the kitchen where she was preparing the kids for school. She gave me a nervous look and apologized, explaining that she was running late. I didn't say anything at the time but decided we needed to discuss expectations later. Over time, our dynamic changed. We maintained a respectful relationship in front of the children and friends, but in private, I found myself drawn to a sense of control. I can't explain why, but I felt different now, detached, yet still connected in certain moments. Before she left, I had treated her like a lady, always showing care and affection. But now something was different. I no longer saw our relationship through the same lens. When we were with the kids or in public, we seemed like a normal family. However, in private, I struggled with my emotions. Was this still love, or was it something else? Would she ever betray my trust again? I didn't know, and oddly, I didn't care as much as I once did. What I did know was that I would never let myself be vulnerable again. Do I still love her? Some days I think I do when I see her caring for a sick child, or on Christmas morning when the family is together. But other times, when I remember the past, the pain resurfaces. Life isn't perfect anymore, and maybe it never will be. But at least I'm no longer alone, eating frozen dinners in an empty house. Will I ever let her take control again? No. Will she take my children away from me? No way. Will I marry her again? Not in this lifetime. It's extreme, of course, but this is my reality. I have to go now. David has a soccer game, and there's a parent-teacher conference at the kids' school tonight. Life goes on.